So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining the Ancestry and Diversity Forum this month. I'm pleased to introduce to any who don't already know her, Dr. Daphne Martschenko. She's an assistant professor at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics and former co-organizer of the Race, Empire, and Education Research Collective. Her scholarship identifies novel ways to examine and enhance the ethical and socially responsible conduct, translation, and interpretation of human genetic research. Daphne's passionate about fostering public and community engagement with controversial scientific research. She's appeared in the New York Times and on numerous podcasts, including Freakonomics Radio. You can also find her work in outlets such as Scientific American and The Conversation. In 2023, Daphne was named one of 10 scientists to watch by ScienceNews, and in 2024, she was recognized by Scientist Spotlight's initiative as a science role model to students learning science. Currently, Daphne is writing a book with her friend and colleague, Sam Trejo, a quantitative social scientist interested in how social and biological factors jointly shape human development across the life course. In The Acid We Inherit, they unpack various social, ethical, and policy issues related to the DNA revolution. Thank you so much, Daphne.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Okay, hopefully everyone's seeing everything correctly. As I mentioned earlier, if folks have questions, you can feel free to put it in the Q&A chat box, and I'm happy to answer them as we go along. So today I'm going to be talking about ethics and inclusivity in genetics education, challenges and paths forward. And none of this would be possible at all without these folks here, in particular, some trainees that I have had the pleasure and privilege of getting to work with over the last several years: Justin Gomez-Stafford, Roshni Patel, Rachel Unger, and with additional gratitude to those folks listed down below as well. And just as a note, I received funding from the National Human Genome Research Institute. I am on a K01 award. So I've been asked to talk about genetics education and specifically ethics education within genetics. And I wanted to start by first getting a sense for how familiar this is as a topic to those of you who are here. So I'm using a polling feature called Slido. For Slido, you can either scan the QR code that's in the top left of your screen, or you can go to slido.com and put in those string of numbers. But first, just curious to hear whether your institution offers genetics-specific ethics education. And if you're unsure, you can also select unsure, but just to get a sense for where we're coming from. All right, people are starting to respond. Okay, so far, most people unsure. And hopefully this is something that we'll get to talk more about during the Q&A portion, the discussion portion. Okay, gonna give it a few more seconds. Response is still coming in. Okay. So most people unsure about whether their institution offers genetics-specific ethics education. I'm going to follow this up with another question, which is why consider ethics and inclusivity in genetics research and its translation? Basically, why might we think it's important to have genetics-specific ethics education? And this is a word cloud, so you can put in any string of words that come to mind here. All right, people are typing. ELSI, and for those who don't know, ELSI stands for Ethical, Legal, Social Implications. Equity. Equity coming through for a number of folks here. I see safety also. trust, eugenics, respect. It's a critical part of the subject. Okay, trust and equity coming through particularly strong here. Harm. All right, so brief recap. Majority of people who filled out the poll are unsure if their institution offers ethics-specific education. People feeling that having ethics-specific education, considering the ethics and inclusivity in genetic research and its translation are important, particularly for trust and equity reasons. So we know that genomic data have growing impacts on society. We also see that happening in, for instance, the direct-to-consumer genetic testing landscape. There are a number of quote unquote genetic tests or genetic reports that are available to consumers for relatively small amounts of money. In my world, so I am a bioethicist that is interested in examining the ethical, legal, and social implications of human genetic and genomic research. One emerging development or application of genomic data has been in the realm of polygenic embryo selection. The idea that prospective parents who are already undergoing IVF might be able to learn the polygenic scores for their viable embryos for a host of different conditions, behaviors, social outcomes, in addition to polygenic scores for things like cardiovascular disease and cancers. Prospective parents can also learn embryos' polygenic scores for things like autism spectrum disorder and height. And there seems to be some general indication of public support for practices such as these downstream applications of the genomic research that many of us in this Zoom room conduct. So this was a study that came out in Science, February 2023, that found that if the polygenic embryo selection were to be provided for free, nearly 40% of Americans said that they would use it to increase their child's likelihood of getting into a selective college. And currently there are no legal restrictions on such applications. So we know that genomic data are having growing impacts on society, both in terms of the provision of clinical care and in terms of some of our societal institutions, and there's significant societal implications to this work. Related to that, some of these impacts that genomic data are having on society are harmful. And we saw a growing conversation about this coming out following the Buffalo shooting in May of 2022, in which 10 Black Americans were killed by a white supremacist who cited a number of genomic studies as purported evidence of the biological superiority of white people over Black people. The Buffalo shooting is just one data point in a much larger story. If folks may remember, there was a New York Times piece that came out in October of 2018 that looked at how white supremacist groups had latched onto genomic studies on lactate persistence, a person's ability to digest lactose. My colleague Jed Carlson, who's at UT Austin now, had a paper that came out recently showing that these scientific memes or pseudoscientific tables and figures that are using data from these genomic studies increase following the circulation of these memes increase following political events or mass shootings. So we know that some of the impacts that genomic data can have on our society are harmful. Of course, there are many different communities who have the responsibility to mitigate the harms of genetics and also to promote its benefits. So a lot of folks in this room are researchers, but there are other entities, other actors who also have an obligation to think about the impacts of research. This includes funders, academic journal editors, media journalists, scientists, members of industry, educators, just to name a few. This is a world in which there are multiple communities who are affected by research, who also affect research. And when considering the fact that there are these multiple entities who are involved in how research is conducted and translated, I think there are two things that I want to emphasize here as framing this conversation and the rest of my presentation. So one is, if we think about who gets to define the harms and benefits of research, traditionally, that's been left to researchers, to professional societies, to regulatory bodies. And the other challenge is that the existing mechanisms for regulating the ethical conduct of research are limited in their ability to anticipate and respond to the downstream implications of research, especially the potential social harms. So if we consider human subjects research, for instance, IRBs are expressly prohibited by the common rule from considering any broad social or policy risks. IRBs also generally don't regulate risks other than those that are directly encountered by research participants. And in fact, many genomic studies aren't even considered human subjects research. And so the kind of most common approach that we have within academic institutions to considering the ethical conduct of research are confined to human subjects research, and a lot of genomics research can fall outside of that designation. So I'm going to be talking about two specific projects that I've been involved in and that have really been trainee-led, which I think is a testament to the fact that we have a cohort of early career researchers who are really thinking deeply about not only what are some of the ethical and social implications of the work that they're doing, but also are taking it upon themselves to try and make sure that they feel equipped to be able to navigate those issues as they progress through their careers. So, I mentioned that there are many different communities that have a responsibility to mitigate the harms of genetics and promote its benefits. And one group that I'm going to talk about in particular today are medical geneticists. So I'm sure this is familiar news to everyone here, but these are folks who work at the intersection of research and clinical care. These include clinical geneticists, clinical laboratory geneticists, genetic counselors, other healthcare professionals, for instance, nurses caring for patients and families affected by genetics conditions. And alongside my colleague, Justin Gomez-Stafford, who is a genetic counselor at Harvard Children's, really became interested in trying to understand medical genetics and genomics residents' perceptions of their gaps in knowledge regarding the clinical intersections of race and racism. And so Justin, as part of his master's thesis for his genetic counseling degree, undertook a qualitative research study to investigate current MGG resident perspectives on issues of race and racism in clinical settings and the recommendations for enhancing training on such issues. He conducted 16 semi-structured interviews between November 2022 and March 2023. We analyzed these interviews using inductive thematic analysis. And really, we were motivated to undertake this study because on the one hand, despite existing efforts, despite the growing acknowledgement within the field of human genetics of its history and the potential social harms and past harms that the field has contributed to, that systemic racism remains ingrained in academic institutions and scientific practices. Another motivation for conducting this study was that the existing literature disproportionately emphasized the perspectives of current and training genetic counselors, and the views of clinical medical geneticists we felt were understudied. This was a qualitative research study, as I mentioned, and so I want to just provide a few notes on qualitative research. Qualitative research, at its core, it asks open-ended questions whose answers are not easily put into numbers, such as how and why. A qualitative approach allows participants to explain how and why and what they're thinking or feeling and experiencing at a certain time or during an event of interest. Qualitative research is really about detailing the emotions, words, and perspectives of people, and it's about providing a rich contextualized understanding of some aspect of human experience. And so in these ways, it is different from quantitative research. So I'm going to go through some high-level summary of results and then provide some excerpts from interviews to illustrate these findings. So one thing we saw was that participants described feeling ill-equipped to navigate interpersonal clinical dynamics and discussions with patients and colleagues because of the impact of race and racism on such interactions. So for instance, participants recorded having received no formal opportunities to discuss racial issues in MGG specifically. Some had informal discussions with faculty and genetic counselors on such topics. And it's also possible that because these were current MGG residents, that they may have gone on to receive such education at a latter point following the interview. But I really want to point out here that approximately half of those 16 folks that we interviewed were already halfway through their residency. 2 were in the final month of residency, and no one described having received formal opportunities to learn and discuss racial issues that were specific to medical genetics and genomics. And so this lack of education contributing to people feeling ill-prepared to navigate interpersonal clinical dynamics and discussions with patients and colleagues. And so let's look at some examples here of folks describing not only how they felt ill-equipped, but kind of why they didn't feel like they had received any formal opportunities to gain training and education on these topics specific to MGG. So one was this sense of an avoidance of race-related issues. So this is an excerpt with one participant who said, it's not a topic that's really even been discussed. We don't discuss health disparities. We don't discuss racial disparities. We don't discuss implicit bias here. And they're talking about their particular residency program. It's just taboo. Nobody talks about it. We also saw a theme of people talking about the dismissal of race-related issues. So this participant saying she, and referring to one of their MGG attendings, just happens to sort of like this topic and discusses it more openly. So a positive example of someone who is in this mentorship position, talking and discussing these issues openly, but they go on to say, I have noticed that other attendings or providers are sort of dismissive of this topic. We also saw that participants had perceived gaps in knowledge, specifically around things like dysmorphology discernment in patients of color, navigating interpersonal racial dynamics, discussing race and ethnicity with patients during personal and family history discussions, for instance, being unsure about what the appropriate terminology to use might be, and also addressing personal or taught racial bias when counseling patients of color. So these were examples of areas where people described feeling specifically ill-equipped to navigate. This is an excerpt from an interview with a participant who talks about the current standard that is used and how education based on that standard leaves them feeling ill-prepared to engage with more diverse patient populations. So they say, I mean, all patients are different and you kind of standardize only with the white populations. So going to see syndromes, you can see that, yeah, they're dysmorphic, but I cannot rely on information because it's harder to put it together as a provider because we're used to seeing white population. Participants also proposed formal interactive opportunities focused on racial issues that emphasis here were specific to the field of medical genetics and genomics, and that they be incorporated into medical genetics and genomics training and with faculty participation. So some specific recommendations included simulations, seminars, didactics, further collaboration with other healthcare professionals such as genetic counselors, and here's an example of that latter point, working with genetic counselors. Participants said, med students do have this training on racial issues, but it's so particular for genetics because in our field, we have so many concepts that are unique to genetics. At least the first 2 or 3 months of residency, shadowing the genetic counselors in some sessions would be a good thing to do. And I also mentioned that one thing that these trainees talked about was wanting faculty participation, wanting their attendees, those who were, in mentorship positions to them to also gain training on these types of issues. So here's an example of a participant saying the attendings need the training. It cannot just be the residents, it can't just be the fellows, the attendings need the training and they need this training in an effective way. So pointing out that, while we were focused in particular on the experiences of current MGG residents, that these residents also felt like the education that they saw themselves lacking was something that they felt their attendings could benefit from receiving as well. So I think a little later in the presentation, hopefully we'll have some time to kind of brainstorm around what are some of the challenges to being able to actually implement this kind of education and training. But I want to talk through an example of a education related initiative that is focused on providing trainees with education and training in genetics around the ethical social implications of their work. So there's a paper that came out fairly recently, within the last year, describing this project that I'm going to be talking through. It was led by those 2 wonderful individuals that I highlighted at the start of the presentation, Roshni Patel and Rachel Ungar. Roshni is now doing a postdoc at the University of Southern California. Rachel is here with me at Stanford at the Center for Biomedical Ethics. And so we're fortunate to to have her. But Roshni and Rachel were both PhD students in the genetics department at Stanford. And the project, the course that they really spearheaded the development of came out of a feeling that many Stanford genetics department students wanted more ethics education. And so Rachel and Roshni, in addition to the rest of the team, ran a survey of current, incoming, and past genetics PhD students within the Stanford genetics department to gather their perspectives on gaining ethics education. And so we saw over half of those who responded to this survey, there were 71 individuals who took this survey, wanted increased ethics education within the existing course requirements. We saw that a third, just under a third, thought that increasing ethics education could happen by creating a new course. Only 6% said that they felt there was no need to increase ethics education, that the responsible conduct of research course that they may have taken was sufficient. And then 10% said there was no need to mandate greater ethics education, but the department can better publicize existing coursework. So the NIH has a requirement for taking coursework on the responsible conduct of research. The topics that are covered in this course, and I have been involved in teaching the RCR course within Stanford and our medical school, includes things like conflict of interest, policies regarding human subjects, mentor-mentee responsibilities, collaborative research, peer review, data acquisition, and laboratory tools. They're an array of different topics. They're not specific to genetics per se, and they are important, but the requirements have a lot of focus on breadth and not so much on depth. And so these trainees in the genetics department wanted to build a course from scratch. I got involved in the beginning when I was still a postdoc at Stanford, and I'm fortunate to now be a faculty sponsor for this course in my role as an assistant professor. But the process really started during the pandemic with brainstorming options for increasing ethics education, followed by developing a curriculum for a 3-week pilot course after receiving some grant funding, teaching that course, revising it, and then expanding it. And I'm going to go through all of this now. So the journey to developing this mini course, this first stage where there was a 3-week mini course, the team applied for a seed grant from the Ethics Society and Technology Hub. This is an internal funding mechanism within Stanford University. And we're fortunate to receive $25,000 to help to develop a mini course focused on genetics, ethics, and society. We used a backwards course design and structured the class using Bloom's taxonomy. So what does this mean? It means that we wanted to first identify what were the results, what were the outcomes that we wanted to be met through this course, and then work backwards from there, planning the learning experience and instruction after having first identified what the intended results or outcomes for the course were to be. So this course focuses on things like, how does the historical context connect to modern day genetic research? What are the ethical and societal implications of genetic research? How do societal structures and norms, along with personal identities and responsibilities, impact genetic research? And our overall goal was that all biosciences graduates have the tools to consider the ethical and social responsibilities that arise from the history of biomedical research. So this is a course that is particularly focused on the ethical social implications of genetic genomic research, but we wanted to make it a course that would be welcoming and invite students from across the biosciences. We really prioritize active learning. So typically the course intercourses short 30-minute lectures with individual reflection, small group discussion and debate, and then a large group share out. So here's an example of a typical class. There would be a pre-class assignment, for instance, ask your non-scientist friends and family about their concerns on genome sequencing, followed by a small group discussion reflecting on that assignment, a lecture on the overview of genomic data collection, small group discussion looking at different biobanks and their data policies, followed by a group discussion, and then another short lecture on community research, talking in particular in this example about the Havasupai tribe, their experiences with genomic research, and in particular the misuse of their samples by researchers from Arizona State University who conducted studies that were beyond the scope of the consent that these participants had signed on to, and small group discussion. So a very much moving between small group discussion, lecture, large group share out within the day. So in 2023, we were able to move beyond holding that 3-week mini course. The 3-week mini course we held in the spring of 2022. It was quite successful. We had a lot of student engagement and excitement about the course, and we're able to convince the genetics department at Stanford to support the development of a quarter-long course on this topic. So the 3-week mini course was kind of a proof of concept, demonstrating that there was interest in taking this course and that it could be done. And so in the quarter-long course, we were able to expand to cover more topics than we had in the mini course. We were able to devote 2 whole sessions to race, ancestry, and genetics. We also added a session on behavior and genetic determinism. And so we're really fortunate to be able to double the time that we had with students, and covered things like the history of eugenics. The students even went on a quote unquote field trip, although it was within Stanford's campus, to the archives to look at some of the archival documents about some of Stanford's own university leaders and their involvement in the eugenics movement. We also, in this course, talk about the relationship between society and science and society in the present day. So earlier I had mentioned, that there are growing impacts of genomic data on society, and talked through, some of the uses of genomic data by white supremacist alt-right groups. This is something that also we discuss in this course, and we talk through questions like who is doing the science, what kinds of research questions get studied, who benefits and who is harmed. So those challenges that I had talked about earlier in terms of thinking through who gets to define the harms and benefits of research, and what are the existing mechanisms for guiding the ethical conduct and regulation of research, and how does that kind of leave aside or under neglect to some extent considering the downstream social implications of research. These are the kinds of things that we're discussing in this course. There's also a big emphasis on social responsibility and really grappling with the debate that can exist within the scientific community around the extent to which genetics researchers, scientific researchers more broadly, have social responsibilities when it comes to some of the downstream uses of their research. And I provide these 2 excerpts kind of showing the different sides to thinking about social responsibility. So one example of Thomas Hunt Morgan saying back in 1915, if eugenicists want to do this sort of thing, well and good, but I think it is just as well for some of us to set a better standard and not appear as participators in the show. I have no desire to make any fuss. And then another example, several decades later, following the publication of the bell curve, saying people keep asking me why I do not rebut the bell curve. The answer is because it is so stupid that it is not rebuttable. So this debate over, what does social responsibility look like? To what extent should people be practicing social responsibility, and challenges around that. One of the things that the team felt was really important to do with this course was to make it publicly available online for other trainees, other institutions that might be hoping to implement an ethics-specific genetics education within their existing curriculum. So you can also access this in that cell genomics paper, but we have it up on GitHub for folks that might be interested in gaining access to it. And one of the other things that we thought was really important was evaluating the course. So we went in hoping that it was going to prove to be a valuable experience for students, but we wanted to confirm that it in fact was. And so students took a survey before the start of the course. They took another one at the end of the course. And in short, they enjoyed it. So folks saying that they enjoyed the sessions they attended, that it was one of their favorite courses, that it was worth every minute. And we thought, it's all well and good if people enjoyed it and had fun, but how did they feel about their position as a researcher, as someone who will go on to make an impact on their career? Did they feel like they had the tools to be able to navigate some of the ethical and social issues that might arise around the conduct and translation of genomic research? So after the course, students felt that they could better reason through the relationship between science and society, recognizing that there's this inextricable relationship between genetics and society, recognizing the history under which their field was founded and how that influences the research that gets done today, but positively students feeling like they have tools to engage in conversations related to the ethical implications of genetics research. After the course, students also described feeling more empowered to enact change, so feeling that they could be better advocates for more ethical science, that they were thinking about who benefits and participates in my work, and to consider those harms and benefits as they do their work or design their research studies, and feeling that they can personally make a change towards helping research to be more ethical and inclusive in both its structure and how it's conducted. These are just some highlights I wanted to share from that post-class survey. One student saying, "I'm dumbfounded that this is the first time I'm learning about the ethical considerations of being a genetics researcher. This class helped me develop insight into the potential impact of my research on society. It's allowed me to explore my role as a scientist in these ethical debates." And feeling like, this is something that students in genetics departments should take. This course is an elective course. Students aren't required to take it. Currently, there have been discussions within the genetics department at Stanford about whether to make it a mandated course. Would be very interested to hear people's thoughts on that. I think it's always a challenge to consider, how do you make something mandated without making it then become a box ticking exercise? So we had a quarter-long course in the spring of 2023. We were able to hold that spring 2024 quarter-long course again. And just wanted to provide some information on who's actually taking this class. So we capped the class around 20-25 students. And we've seen, as I mentioned, one of the goals of this course was for it to be applicable to students across the biosciences. And we have seen that to be the case, that we have students from across the biosciences who are enrolling in this course. It's not just folks who are in genetics per se. We have folks in cancer biology, developmental biology, neuroscience. We also have some undergrads who have taken the course in addition to grad students, postdocs, and even a visiting researcher. So we were able to host another quarter-long version of this course. We tweaked the curriculum again. We really do believe on constant evaluation and revisiting what we're teaching, why we're teaching it, what might we be missing. And so we tweaked the spring 2024 course to include a session on genetics and the law and another on CRISPR, biotech, and forensics. The other sessions stayed very similar to what we had in the spring of 2023 course. So I want to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. And so I'm going to start my wrap up here. But I've spoken about this course that was really trainee-led by PhD students within the genetics department who felt that they weren't getting sufficient training on ethics-related issues that were specific to their research within genetics and genomics, and the steps that they took to try and get that training for themselves. And I also talked about some findings that we've had with speaking with medical genetics genomics residents about their perceived gaps in knowledge regarding race and race-related issues that arise in clinical practice, and seeing there that another example of trainees who are feeling like they're not getting the appropriate education to know how to adequately care for all their patients. So trainees, kind of as a summary between the two, trainees did not feel adequately trained to consider social responsibilities. And we found, especially with this genetics course, that simply creating a space for discussions about ethics had an impact. Students across home programs noticed this gap in their training. They wanted a course that helps them reflect on broader impacts of their work. We see this with the genetics course that I just described. We also see that the MGG residents noticed gaps in their training. They wanted MGG-specific education on these topics. And we also noticed that with the genetics course, that attendance is dominated by underrepresented and historically excluded minorities. And so 73% of students who took our course, the Genetics, Ethics, and Society course, came from underrepresented groups within STEM education, which I think raises an additional question around how do you reach a broader array of students and help them to see this course as one that's applicable to them and that will help make their research better, help make their ability to care for patients down the line more effective. And so I'd love to get people's thoughts on this as well. But yeah, big take home message here. Trainees want more education. Why? Well, one reason is that genetics research has far reaching implications for society. Students want tools to understand these implications. Students are also poised to be scientific leaders in fields where ongoing breakthroughs consistently give rise to complex ethical dilemmas. And not knowing how to navigate those dilemmas can cause distress. It can also make people, put people in positions where they don't feel poised to be the leader that they can be. And irrespective of their areas of focus, trainees are or will be regarded as scientific authorities. And I think it's fair to say that one of the things that we've seen is that they want to be able to better communicate with non-academic audiences, whether that's an MGG trainee who wants to be able to better care for their diverse patient populations, or whether that's a PhD student in genetics who wants to think about who they include in their research and how to do, for instance, community engaged approaches as they design and conduct their studies. So I've talked about this need for education, this desire for greater education, but I also want to acknowledge that there are challenges to integrating this kind of training into the existing genetics education. Trying to introduce something new may necessarily entail taking out something that is there now. And so I have another poll, which is to get your thoughts on what some of the challenges are to integrating this kind of education into the current way that we educate our genetics trainees and residents. Faculty pushback, buy-in. Personal beliefs, overloaded. Yep. People are typing. Political beliefs. Yep. And we're about to head into a historic election tomorrow. Engagement. Silos. Understanding the importance. Curriculum. Yeah. So hopefully this can help kickstart the discussion, the Q&A portion. I wanted to make sure to leave plenty of time. I just saw egos come in, absolutely. I'll continue to leave this up for a few minutes as people continue to type it in, but I wanted to open it up for discussion now. Thank you so much for having me. Again, thank you so much to all of the trainees that I've been really fortunate to get to work with on these projects who are really the drivers behind it and have inspired the work that I get to do every day.
Thank you so much, Daphne. That was fantastic. And there's already one question in the Q&A from Betty Cohn, which I think really comes off of this last poll. How do you recommend creating a course about ethics, race implications for genomics students where the department faculty and/or students do not think it's, quote, their job or within the scope of their obligations, responsibilities?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And, I think when Rachel and Roshni started this genetics course, they had to do a lot of work to demonstrate the desire for a genetics ethics course. They had to really make the case to their department that it was something that was worth investing time and resources in, and that was also worth them investing their time in, given that they were in the midst of their PhDs doing technical projects that did not require them putting together a course. And so there was a lot of work that went into making that case, like running the survey, like applying for an internal seed grant. And a lot of that was, highly motivated individuals who were working against the existing incentive structures within academia. I think one of the things that has been really interesting, for lack of a better word, as this course has become something that more folks are familiar with, are the number of trainees that we get from other institutions who are interested in implementing something like it in their curriculum. And also the number of faculty that we have come to us who are interested in implementing a course like this. And I think, it's really challenging when there isn't that buy-in, and that was something that came through a lot in the Slido, buy-in, engagement. But I think what we're hoping with making this course available, kind of open access the curriculum, is that even if there is just one person in a department who is interested in this, they now have access to a support network of folks who have gone through the struggles of trying to make the case for this ethics specific kind of education, and are realizing that they're not alone in wanting to receive this education, and can kind of get a lessons learned from folks who have gone through those struggles before them. I think we also wanted to make it open access so that if folks are in situations where their department doesn't want to implement this course, or they don't have the support or the time to be able to implement a full-blown quarter-long course, that they at least have access to those materials themselves, and can do a kind of self-education. But I think it's a real challenge to think about how to shift the very entrenched structures that we have, and that was part of the reason why I talked about some of these broader societal level structures that inform how we think about risk and benefit, what kinds of risks and benefits we're primed to think of as researchers, and also who's defining those risks and benefits. So I think there also needs to be a kind of bigger structural shift in order to realign realign the incentives with the need for greater ethics education.
And I know Sharon has her hand raised.
Yeah, Daphne, thanks so much. I did get a little bit confused about your audience, because you started out talking about like medical genetics residents, of which any given program has a couple a year. Even bigger programs have maybe 4. If you're talking about clinical genetics residents. But then it seemed like you then shifted in really talking about graduate students, if I understood it correctly, for this course. Who were the main people taking the course?
So I presented 2 different projects
Right.
that are not related to each other,
Okay.
to demonstrate that in these 2 different trainee groups, there was this desire for greater education. So
Okay.
the course that I described was taken primarily by, and I can pull up the slide with the demographics of course attendees again.
Well, that's okay, but it was predominantly graduate students, right?
Predominantly graduate students in genetics, and we also had other students from across the biosciences, but we had some undergrads, some postdocs, some lab. We had a lab assistant, for instance, take the course, a visiting researcher.
So my thought about that was that this is where NIH could be your friend, right? The RCR requirements are nationally broadcast, and every graduate program, every NIH postdoctoral program follows them. So my question was, what about, and I don't think those requirements have been updated for a number of years. Maybe in my memory, maybe 10 years ago, they made the big switch to it has to be continuous and they changed the rules. I don't think they've changed them substantially in the last 10 years, as someone who had a T32 for many years. So I guess I just wonder whether presenting some of this, not maybe the whole course, but some of this, and really perhaps updating what is required under RCR might be one way to get the message out.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have a couple thoughts. So one is, and this is something that I kind of posed as a point of discussion for this whole group, which is, how do you navigate the challenges of making something a requirement and still making it something that people are very engaged in, that it doesn't just become a kind of box to tick? So that's one thing that I think is a challenge that comes with making anything mandated, and that a lot of attention should go into how do you continue to make a course like this something that students want to take, that is engaging, that they don't feel like it's something that they just need to get through if you make it a requirement. The other thing that I'll say is that NIH has updated their requirements. And so for instance, I mentioned that I've been involved in the RCR course that we teach here at Stanford. We just revised the curriculum last year, a couple years ago, to comply with the additional NIH requirements, which have really focused on expanding the number of things that we need to cover in the course. There's been, for instance, there a lot more emphasis on training folks on data handling and thinking about rigor and reproducibility and data acquisition and laboratory tools. But I think the issue maybe with the NIH is that, the NIH is huge and they have lots of different areas of research and lots of researchers, and it's not necessarily specific to genetics. I think it's another question to think about if someone like NHGRI specifically would want to try and implement some kind of training that would be specifically focused on genetics and ethics. And yeah, I have not had conversations with anyone at NHGRI about that, but that's an interesting point for sure.
Thank you. Thanks.
There's another question in the Q&A. One of the challenges I've heard and felt, especially for trainees and early stage investigators, is how to speak up during talks or other scientific discussions, to raise concerns, add historical context, etc. Is there something akin to bystander training or other skills or approaches, or how to intervene and help apply the types of knowledge gained in the course?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Sarah. Thank you for asking it. And it is very hard when, as a trainee, you're not in a position of power or don't feel that you're in a position of power to speak up and worry about the potential ramifications of doing so. So I just want to acknowledge that I think you're naming something that is very real. One of the things that, I guess there are a couple of things that I'd want to emphasize. One is, and I think this is related to my answer to Betty's question around some of the reasons why we made this course open access, was wanting to start to build a network of trainees who feel strongly about these issues and who wanted education on these issues, so that they can kind of connect with each other and know that they're not alone, and can kind of brainstorm with each other to get feedback. The other thing that I'll say is I think it's really important to identify faculty allies, those who are maybe in more stable positions, who can help to be that voice when you feel like it's not, it's a position that might be particularly compromising to place yourself in. In terms of your specific question regarding bystander training or other skills or approaches to intervene and help apply the types of knowledge gained in the course, I think one of the goals of the course is to help people come out of it feeling like they've got the tools to be able to have these difficult conversations, and to have the network to help them figure out how to navigate these difficult conversations. I'm not aware of kind of any specific bystander trainings that are focused on genetics and ethics related issues that might come up related to that. But I think one of the goals of this course writ large, one of the broader aims of this course, is to help provide people with some tools to both identify when there might be an ethical issue related to the research, and then to gain ideas for how to navigate that. So as one example, something that we offer at Stanford that I know some other institutions have is a bench-side ethics consultation service. And so this is something that we make sure students in the course are aware about. The bench-side ethics consultation service is set up for researchers at any stage of the research process, but ideally early on in the research process, to come and gather ethical expertise on some of the issues that might arise through the conduct or the design or the translation of a study, or the delivery of a product. Sometimes we have industry that come to us with consults. So we try and provide examples of those kinds of resources that may be available, where folks can go and seek that additional support and guidance. But you are raising a really, really difficult question. And, I think it is totally understandable that a trainee may be in a position where they feel uncomfortable with speaking out and raising concerns because of fear of potential ramifications for their research, for their career, for how they're treated by mentors. The only other thing that I'll add to that is, the RCR course that folks take, at least what we offer at Stanford, there is a section on, talking about safe workplace environments and the institutional resources that are available to folks around navigating those kinds of environments, like an ombudsperson and things like that.
And we just had a question that was something I was wondering as well, which is where to find the course on GitHub. And
Yeah.
I believe I just found it.
Yeah, I had the QR code and the link on a slide for a very brief time, so I can also paste it if that's helpful.
I was going to say that would be great if you could put it in the chat. And I can also share my screen for a moment so people can see what it looks like.
Seeing your
You're
inbox
sharing
right
your
now,
email.
I think.
Oh no. Never mind.
I think people can
I put
get
it in the chat, but I don't know if everyone can access it because it just says for hosts and panelists. So I'm not sure if that went out to everybody.
Oh, here we go. Let me make sure. Let me just repaste it to, whoops, come on. If it'll let me copy and paste it. There we go. Now it is in the chat to everyone.
Awesome, thank you.
So we have about 4 minutes left, and I know we have a hard stop at 10 o'clock, but I wanted to see if there were any other questions for Daphne or any final thoughts that you wanted to share.
I did have a thought, not necessarily a question. In regards to Sharon's point about involving NIH, so the training and things that they have for the All of Us research program, like before you have access to any of the data or the platform, is actually a lot better than what I've seen historically for a lot of genetics and genomics research. So I'm not sure if maybe whomever helped develop that might be more of a resource in regards to, exposure and getting this type of information out, but it's worth a thought.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I agree that training is definitely one that has kind of stood out from other trainings that I've seen. The one thing that I will say that I think we'll have to think about regarding the All of Us research program and that training is their policy on stigmatizing research. I've heard from researchers that it's not always clear to them what falls under stigmatizing research and what the kind of process is for hearing back on whether their study is stigmatizing research and what they should do if it is. But I agree that the training is a noticeable difference from, I think, a lot of other biobanks and the process that researchers have to go through to access the data. Oh, you're muted, Rachel.
Oh, that kind of morning. I was going to say, if there are no other questions, I will just thank you again, Daphne, for joining us and presenting today. And the recording from today's webinar will be up on the ClinGen website and on YouTube later today. Sharon, did you have final thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Clarissa put a comment again somewhere the other participants can't see, that this is very relevant to what the Ancestry and Diversity Working Group is working on with regard to training on the use of the descriptors. And certainly we can keep some of your lectures in mind as we're developing that training. So
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone.